the Vietnam War, one of the most controversial conflicts in American history. And at the heart of this war, the strategies and decisions of President Richard Nixon. But did Nixon's realpolitik approach to Vietnam bring about peace, or did it merely prolong the inevitable? Nixon entered the 1964 presidential race with Vietnam as a key issue, but he wasn't looking to end the war. He wanted to expand it. Nixon believed that to win decisively, the US needed to strike hard at the strongholds of the enemy. He dismissed those advocating for withdrawal or neutralization of South Vietnam, calling it appeasement, a surrender on the installment plan. Nixon's hawkish stance pushed for escalation, while subtly attacking President Lyndon B. Johnson for not going thoroughly. He even compared negotiations with Saigon to negotiating with Hitler before the German armies had been driven from France. Yet neither Nixon nor Johnson wanted to declare war on North Vietnam, fearing a repeat of the Korean War and Chinese intervention. China was prepared for a defense of Vietnam, if necessary, relocating key industries inland in case of escalation. Instead of direct confrontation, China played a strategic game, arming North Vietnam, training pilots, and countering every American action. Meanwhile, the US was mired in asymmetrical guerrilla warfare due to a want to avoid said Chinese intervention, a sitting duck to oncoming North Vietnamese assaults. Any victory in Vietnam would need to be wholly unconventional. As the 1968 election approached, the war only grew more divisive. Nixon shifted to a more moderate tone, while Johnson wrestled with the choice between expansion or withdrawal. Eventually, Johnson dropped out, and Nixon won the presidency, implementing his realpolitik strategy to win with limited American involvement, Vietnamization. On paper, Vietnamization seemed brilliant. By arming South Vietnam, the West could finally fight a conventional war. South Vietnam could strike into strongholds in Cambodia and Laos, supported by American training, supplies, and air power. Nixon aimed for a negotiated settlement that kept Saigon independent, much like in Korea. Vietnamization wasn't Nixon's only tool. He expanded air, ground, and counterinsurgency operations and applied the madman strategy, threatening excessive force to keep the communist bloc off balance. But by July 1969, it was clear his strategy had failed. Neither the North Vietnamese nor the Soviets were cooperating. Public pressure mounted for withdrawal. Despite campaigning to end the war, Nixon escalated it, launching secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. Operations Menu and Freedom Deal became the heaviest aerial bombardment in history. Over 7 billion tons of bombs dropped. For comparison, World War II saw only 2 billion tons. Laos became the most heavily bombed country per capita worldwide. Public opinion turned resolutely against the war. The October 15th moratorium in 1969 saw over 2 million people strike, the largest demonstration in American history. A month later, 500,000 more took to the streets in more strikes. These protests blindsided Nixon, forcing him to cancel Operation Duck Hook, a planned dramatic escalation against North Vietnam. At the same time, Nixon was orchestrating a significant escalation against North Vietnam, known as Operation Duck Hook. This plan involved a 4-day bombing campaign, targeting military and economic sites, along with the mining of ports. The strategy envisioned intense Hiroshima-Nagasaki-style attacks to force concessions from the North Vietnamese. The proposed escalation even included bombing dikes, launching a land invasion of North Vietnam, and the potential use of nuclear weapons. However, the escalating anti-war protests took Nixon by surprise. His madman strategy, which depended on maintaining a credible threat through domestic support, was undermined as public opinion turned increasingly hostile. With growing demonstrations and a strong backlash, Nixon was forced to abandon Operation Duck Hook, his high-stakes bluff aimed at pressuring North Vietnam. In 1970, the political upheaval in Cambodia presented Nixon with a new strategic opportunity. The coup there disrupted North Vietnamese supply lines and offered a chance to strike at their sanctuaries, potentially weakening their grip on the region. Nixon seized this opportunity with the aim of eliminating North Vietnamese strongholds and strengthening South Vietnam's position. However, this action sparked intense domestic backlash. The escalation of the war into Cambodia, a country not directly involved in the conflict, triggered a wave of protests and public outrage. This unrest reached a tragic peak on May 4, 1970, when National Guardsmen opened fire on students at Kent State University, killing 4 and wounding 9. The Kent State shootings symbolized the deepening divide within American society over the war and amplified anti-war sentiment. The overwhelming public outcry forced Nixon to re-evaluate his strategy, and by June 30, 1970, he was compelled to announce the withdrawal of US troops from Cambodia. As 1970 drew to a close, it became increasingly clear that the Vietnam War was spiraling towards a grim conclusion. Nixon's Vietnamization strategy, designed to transfer the burden of fighting to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops, had not achieved its intended results. The South Vietnamese military, though bolstered by American aid, struggled to fend off North Vietnamese forces effectively. This failure to secure a stable and self-sufficient South Vietnam prompted Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, to devise a new plan, the decent interval. This strategy was intended to buy South Vietnam as much time as possible before the complete American withdrawal, hoping that the South Vietnamese government could withstand the pressure long enough to negotiate a favorable settlement. However, this approach was inherently flawed. It provided no guarantees for a victorious outcome or a stable future for South Vietnam. And it was based on the unrealistic hope that time alone could alter the inevitable course of the war, and that American will would remain resolutely behind Vietnam. With America coming to distance itself from the war, the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, marked the end of the war. The strategy ultimately proved inadequate. Despite efforts to fortify South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese forces continued their advance with increasing momentum. The fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, marked the definitive end of the Vietnam War. The swift and decisive victory of the North Vietnamese forces underscored the failure of Nixon's realpolitik strategy. While Nixon's approach sought to balance military pressure with diplomatic maneuvering, it resulted in a costly and protracted conflict that did not achieve its objectives. The prolonged engagement led to significant loss of life, widespread destruction, and a profound impact on American foreign policy and public opinion. Nixon's decisions, driven by a mix of political calculation and strategic ambition, ultimately left a legacy of disillusionment and mistrust. The war's outcome not only shaped American foreign policy for decades, but also left deep scars on the American consciousness, influencing how future conflicts were approached and how the US engaged with the world stage.